Hi everyone, I hope those posters are going well. It's been a few weeks since we have looked at them. So far you should have a world to remind us of how God created the world. Then we have our snake shaped like an S to remind us of sin. Then we have our stars to remind us of the promise that God gave to Abraham, that the number of people in Abraham's family would be greater than the number of stars in the sky. Then we should have our rainbow to remind us of how God rescued Noah and his family from the flood, and then God promised that he would never flood the whole earth again. And then we have Jacob's 12 sons, which reminds us of the story of Joseph from our last episode. And these posters will help us to keep track of God's big story, which is going to take us from beginning to everlasting. Now for the next part of our story. Whenever Jacob found out that his son Joseph was alive and living in Egypt, Jacob and all of his family moved to live in Egypt as well. As the years passed, the family got bigger and bigger and bigger. After 400 years, the family had grown into a huge nation, the nation of Israel. In fact, there were so many people that they filled the land of Egypt. The Egyptians were not happy. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was very, very unhappy. And he was very cruel to the people of Israel. He made them work as slaves, and he made their work very, very difficult. The people of Israel called out to God for help. They cried to him to rescue them. And God heard them, and God had a plan. Pharaoh had made a very cruel law that said that if a little baby was born in the people of Israel and it was a little boy, it should be killed. But one of the Israelite ladies had a little baby boy and she decided to hide him. Now you would know that it's not very easy to hide a little baby because they usually make lots and lots of noise. When the baby got a little bigger, she knew that she couldn't hide him for much longer. So she made a basket. She put him in the basket and she set him into the river among the reeds where he would be nice and safe. He was found in the river by Pharaoh's daughter, the princess. This little baby ended up being looked after by his own mummy and then going to live in the palace. And this was all part of God's plan. This little baby was called Moses. Now, whenever Moses was grown up, he did something that he shouldn't have done, and he had to leave Egypt and go to a faraway place because there were people who wanted to kill him because of what he had done. Many years later, God spoke to Moses. Now, God didn't speak to Moses using a telephone or an iPad or something like that. He spoke through a bush that was on fire, but the bush wasn't burning up. God spoke to Moses and gave Moses a very important message. God told Moses that he had heard his people's cry for help. He knew that life was really, really hard for them in Egypt, and he wanted Moses to go to Pharaoh to ask him to let God's people go. Now Moses was very worried and he said, I couldn't do that, but God promised to be with him. So Moses went to Pharaoh and asked Pharaoh to let God's people go. And Pharaoh said no. Moses told Pharaoh that God would send some terrible things to happen in Egypt if he didn't let God's people go. But still Pharaoh said no. So lots and lots of awful things happened. The river Nile turned to blood. But still Pharaoh said no. There were frogs hopping around everywhere. The dust turned into creepy crawly gnats. There were flies filling the air. And still, when Moses said, let God's people go, Pharaoh said no. In fact, sometimes when these awful things were happening, Pharaoh said, if you ask your God to stop this, then I let his people go. But then he changed his mind. There were lots more awful things to come. The animals in Egypt died. The people had lots of sores all over their skin. There were huge hailstones falling from the sky, and the crops in the field were destroyed by locusts. Then it was dark when it should have been daytime. But still, when Moses asked Pharaoh to let God's people go, what do you think Pharaoh said? Pharaoh said no. And that's what we're going to put on our poster today. I would like you to write, "Let God's people go," and underneath, I would like you to write, "No." What was going to have to happen for Pharaoh to say yes, for God to rescue his people from Egypt? All of these stories are part of God's big story, God's plan to rescue his people from sin. A few weeks ago, I was at a place called Carnfunnock. Maybe you've been. It's a lovely place to visit. And as I was having a walk, I saw the maze at Carnfunnock. It's a really, really good maze. The Bible tells us that you and I are lost, not in a maze, but lost from God. We are lost from God because of our sin. Sin is the wrong things that we think and say and do that break God's laws. We choose to go our own way instead of God's way. Our sin separates us from God. It keeps us away from him because he is perfect and holy, and it keeps us out of heaven, God's perfect home. But God loves us so much that he sent his perfect son Jesus to rescue us from sin. If you were lost in a maze, it would be great to have somebody watching from a hill who could tell you exactly where to go. But it would be even better to have someone come into the maze and lead you out of the maze again. Jesus didn't just stand at a distance and shout instructions about how we could be rescued from sin. No, Jesus left heaven. He came to earth. He died on a cross to take the punishment for my sin and yours. He rose again from the dead and he's alive today in heaven. Have you trusted Jesus to forgive your sin? How would God rescue the people of Israel from Egypt? Come back next week to find out.